Authentication and User Account Control. In this nugget, we'll be addressing authentication and user account control, where we'll start off by talking about authentication methods such as username and password, smart cards, biometrics. We'll take a look at authentication issues as well, which normally revolves around somebody forgetting their password. So on a local computer, we'll see what kinds of things that they will lose if they forget their password, even if you reset it for them. We'll take a look at Credential Manager, which is a way of keeping store of any username and password that you've decided to save, for example, in Internet Explorer, and Certificate Management, so that we can see how you can save certificates, particularly important ones such as EFS. We looked at that in the previous nugget as well, by the way. And then we look at the run as command so that you can identify how to elevate privilege to run command line items, for example. And then we take a look also at user rights, because depending on your group membership, you have different levels of privilege. And then we will finally conclude with user account control, which is a prompting that allows certain executables to occur or certain system changes to occur only with the right user account control prompts. Let's get started here talking about authentication. Now, as we do this, I want to first of all clear up another term that sounds a lot like authentication and is closely related, and that is authorization. Authentication simply identifies that you are who you say you are. Usually that's going to be a username and a password. Once you're authenticated, then you have the authorization based upon who you are or your group memberships to access a resource. For example, maybe it's a shared folder here or something like that. So you're authorized to access this, for example, if the correct share or NTFS permissions are there. Could be a printer, could be a service, could be an application, could be a lot of different things. But once you confirm who you are and authenticate, then you have the authority to access something. There's several authentication methods that can be used here. One of the first and most common ones would be a username and password, and that's conventionally how people log on to Windows, even standalone machines. And for that one, they'll have a user account that is stored locally, or they can log on to a domain member computer, and this one will require that they enter in credentials for the domain. So they'll have an Active Directory user account. Now, even if a computer is a member of a domain, you could still log on locally, but you don't get all of the authorization and resources that you would have normally in the domain. For example, your credentials might not work to give you the authorization to access certain file shares and things like this. Another kind of authentication method that you could use would be a smart card. This is actually an excellent way of logging on. These haven't caught on quite as much in the US as they have in certain other countries, but this is what we would also call a multi-factor authentication. In this case, it's two factors. And the reason for that is because you have to both know something, oops, I got to spell know correctly, know, and you also have to possess something. Okay, that's two factors. Then what you have to know is usually a PIN. So that would be, usually it's 4 characters or something like this. Depends on what the policies in your organization. And it's not going to normally be as complicated as a user password. And then you have to possess the actual credit card sized smart card itself, and it usually also has a little contact item on there that will be read by a smart card reader. And then by way of example, I've just got a photograph here of a laptop PC card, smart card reader. And this is something you just put in the PC card slot of the computer. And then inside of that, you would be able to then slip in, I think I've got a picture of one here somewhere. Yeah, something like this. This would be a smart card. It's exactly the same size in this case as a credit card, and you can see it has contacts here, and it has a little bit of circuitry inside of there. And what happens is it will store a user certificate, and because that certificate is stored on the smart card that is directly tied to an Active Directory user account in a Windows context anyway, then it can be a method used to log on for that user. So that's just another method for logging on. Windows 7 also includes something else, by the way, here. It's called PIV, and that's Personal Identity Verification. What's useful about that is it used to be that when you got smart cards, and I've had to do this before, that you would get a smart card reader, and then you would have to download or obtain from the manufacturer cryptographic software. And this could be very expensive. In fact, I had to demonstrate smart cards for a client once, and on my own dime, I had to buy cryptographic software from one of the manufacturers. It cost me hundreds of dollars just to show it to a client. Well, now with Windows 7 and personal identity verification smart cards, it will include a lot of times the cryptographic needs that will be required for that smart card solution. And you may not have to get something from a manufacturer. This is kind of a standardized method now that many manufacturers follow. So you don't need anything extra. And then smart cards as a way of authentication also use something called password extensible authentication protocol. This uses something called also TLS, which is transport layer security. You don't need to memorize this part of it, but I would know that smart cards very frequently will use PEEP. And the reason why that's important is because this is a highly secure way to transmit things such as credentials. And since it's in an encrypted tunnel, it's going to be very difficult, if not impossible, to hack into it directly or to derive any useful information out of it. So smart cards are very much more secure than a username and a password. Oh, I never really finished this. Why is it a smaller PIN than you would normally have for a password? I mean, your password might be 8 characters, but your PIN, if you use these smart cards, might only be 4 characters. Well, that's because they're inherently more secure, because you have to have 2 things, and that is the smart card itself and the PIN. And when you insert the smart card into the reader, a dialog box will prompt you to enter in the PIN for the user, and then you can log on. There's also something here called biometrics. You may have heard of these. You may have seen them on movies, I don't know, Mission Impossible movies or something like this as well. And this is where it will use some physical characteristic of a person. That's where the bio part of this comes in. And it will measure that biological trait. That's where the metrics part of this comes in. So you'll see those in fingerprint scanners. I've had those before. Or optical scanners where it scans your retina. And these are characteristics of an individual person that are not supposed to be duplicable on any other person. I haven't actually used too many of these, some of the fingerprint ones I have, but the only optical scanner I've seen was at the Scottsdale Gun Club, another trainer here in the Phoenix area, Chris Ward, and I decided to go to the Scottsdale Gun Club one day to just kind of do some target shooting and stuff like this. And they had this special room back there for all of the rich snobbery of Scottsdale, and you apparently have to pay quite a premium to get back there, but you can only get back there by going through the optical or retinal scanner. I don't know what they do back there. They probably smoke fat cigars and stuff like that. Anyway, so that's the biometrics. Now, sometimes there may be authentication issues. Very often, actually most often, this is simply going to be a user who has forgotten their password. If this happens in a local environment, we're not talking about Active Directory domains, then whoever the local administrator is or someone with local administrative access could access that user's account in Control Panel, and they can reset that user's password. Again, this is only for local access. You can also reset a user's account in Active Directory in a domain environment, but these things that appear down here don't necessarily apply in that case. So that's the reason why I separate out local as opposed to domain. So in a local environment, if you reset the user's password, they will lose their EFS certificates. This means then that anything they have secured with those certificates, any files that they've secured, will no longer be readable. So you better hope that you have a recovery agent in place. Otherwise, those files will be gone for good. So you may want to ask the user before you reset their password if they have ever encrypted any documents first. And if they have, and there's no data recovery agent, you may need to just work a little bit harder at trying to get them to remember that password, because anything they've encrypted will be gone. Also, if in advance they have backed up their certificates. Remember when we looked at EFS earlier, I showed you there was a facility there to back up the certificate? Well, if that's the case, you can still reset their their password, and then you can restore their certificates from the backed up certificates that they may have done earlier. And that way, not all is lost, but hopefully you still again have a DRA. Also, if the user has forgotten their password and you reset it for them, they will also lose any stored passwords as well. This would be, for example, anything that's in the Windows Vault, also known as Credential Manager, more or less. This is where they've stored internet sites where they require a username and a password. Well, remember there's a checkbox there where they can remember that password. Well, that stores it in the Windows Vault. Same would be true of any other kind of a resource that they've accessed that requires any credentials. That can also be stored there in the Windows Vault. Well, they will lose those passwords if you reset their password. Again, this is local. If they do lose those, there is a way to restore those as well, because you can back up and restore the Windows Vault. Now, in a domain environment, if you reset a user's password that has a user account in Active Directory, then you don't lose any of this. They still keep their EFS certificate, and they still keep whatever stored passwords they might have. So that's not an issue on a domain environment. Another thing you could do is to set up a password reset disk for the user. Again, this is only a local account that this applies to. But the thing to keep in mind is you have to store that in advance on removable storage. Normally that's going to be a floppy disk or a USB flash drive. If they have not created that password reset disk in advance, then there's really no recovery apart from resetting their password. And then the only other kinds of authentication issues might really relate to things such as Active Directory or server availability. Maybe there's not a domain controller available. None of those things are directly part of the 70-680, but I will point out that if a domain controller is not available, normally the user can still use what we call cached credentials. This means then that the last time that they logged on to using a domain controller, it will cache their credentials locally so that if there's no domain controller available the next time they log on, it'll just use credentials out of the cache. Those are only good for so long, though, maximum of about 30 days, because certain parts of the cached credentials expire. And so if they haven't contacted the domain controller within 30 days, they'll definitely have to access one again to log on. And if it's too long, since their computer logged on to a domain controller, like a laptop user that's been out of the office for a couple of months on sabbatical or whatever, then we'll probably have to disjoin and then rejoin their computer to the domain in order to be able to log on to the domain again. Now, I was talking a little bit earlier here about Credential Manager. Let's take a second look at what that is. What this does is it's going to store, backup, and restore any credentials that you have saved. What kind of credentials does it save? Well, it saves things such as terminal services, logons, or remote desktop logons. It stores web access, so that if you've got a membership to a website, then it will store your username and a password there as well. Some websites, like especially highly secure ones like banking, investments websites, those sorts of things, the website does not allow storing of the username and password. It may allow storing of the username, but not both the username and password. So it depends upon whether or not the website will allow for that as well. There's also file servers. If they've accessed a file server from usually a standalone or a work group computer, then they may have to enter in credentials when they access that file server. That can also be stored using a checkbox in the Credential Manager. Some certificates can also be stored in Credential Manager, but not all types of certificates, especially not self-signed certificates and not any certificates that were used for EFS. Another good advantage of using Credential Manager, and by the way, this is a new part of Windows 7, is that you can use it to transfer the credentials to a new PC or to a laptop. Let's say that I normally work on a desktop computer, but now I'm supposed to go out in the field some more, so they gave me a laptop. Well, I can transfer all of my credentials to my new laptop without having to look up all the passwords or try to remember what they all were. And as an example here, I've opened up my own Credential Manager here, and you can see I've connected to a number of different terminal services and remote desktops at various times in the past. This can be tracked back through Control Panel. You can see it's part of User Accounts and Family Safety, or you can just click on Start and in the search box type Credential, and you'll see Credential Manager pop right up. This will just store the passwords for various things that I've accessed, such as this particular server, which actually I don't even have anymore, but this one had a user account, a local user account here, trainer-PC, with the username trainer, and then there was a specific password assigned to that as well. If I want to, I can edit this, and that'll give me an opportunity to put in a different password, for example. And if I'm concerned about the security here, I can remove from the vault. Because anybody that can access this can see the username. You can't see the password, though. Even if you click on edit, you still can't see the password. All you can do is to enter in a new password. But if I'm too concerned about it, I'll just remove that from the vault and click on yes, and there it goes. Of course, if I also want to add a Windows credential in advance, then I'll click Add a Windows Credential. Otherwise, I'll just go ahead and make my connection, and most of the time there'll be some kind of an interface that gives you a checkbox to save the password. But here I'll just enter in whatever it is, and then, of course, the username and password. Then I can also back up the vault And when you back it up, you'll just back it up to a location of your choosing, and then you'll also have an opportunity to give it a name. On restoring, you'll just restore Vault and access it from the same location where you had previously backed it up. Do be careful of this, because Microsoft does a pretty good job of securing this. However, I gotta say, there's just a lot of things involved in this that make me a little bit nervous for highly sensitive machines. I would try not to use this at all for highly sensitive environments. Maybe it's okay for simple standalone machines or home environments, or maybe small offices. And the reason why I mention that is because there's tools that I've used before that can crack all of this stuff apart. I mean, I can get the passwords for, I think, all of this using a tool called Cain and Abel. That's probably the easiest one to use, but there's a number of different other tools out there that you can use to crack these passwords. You do have to have local access, initially at least, and I have to log on locally to be able to crack those passwords, but there's other facilities that I could use to also even remotely crack them. So it's a little bit nerve-wracking if you know a little bit too much about security. Let's also address the certificate management. We talked about that a couple of different times earlier in this nugget, as well as when we talked about EFS. Remember, when you first encrypt a file, it'll automatically pop up for you the Manage Your File Encryption Certificates item, which, is, if you recall, looked like this right here. Okay, we saw that, I think it was in our last nugget. And you click on Next, and you can then identify certificates that you want to use to be able to encrypt your files. And then once you select an appropriate certificate or create a new certificate, then you click on Next, and you can back this up along with a password. And obviously, the usefulness of this is that if we ever have a damaged profile or a computer totally goes bad, and we have to replace the hard drive or something like that, then any of the files that I may have encrypted, which could even be on a network location, well, they will have no way of being decrypted without a DRA, and I would probably want to use my own certificate to access them anyway. So I could use the same facility here to restore a certificate that I had backed up previously. But regardless, you get the idea here. You'll just back it up, save it in a safe location, and then restore it if you have to later on. There's also the certificate manager.msc console. And if I go to a start search item, I can just type cert mgr.msc, and that will open up the certificate management console. And I'll drag that over here as well. And then we can access our certificates here also. Another thing I could do with this is I could also choose all tasks, and then I could choose to export this certificate. When I click on Next, I can also say, yes, export the private key. And if you choose that, it'll choose the Personal Information Exchange or PFX item here as well. And then you just next, finish through the wizard. You have to choose a file location and so forth. But that's another method for managing your certificate management. Pretty much does the same thing as this one would have done. It's just that this one's more user-friendly for those who are not quite as technically adept. I could then also use, and I showed you this in our last nugget as well, I think, the cipher command. If I do a cipher /x, then I'll have to also supply a name like, my certificate or whatever, .pfx, and it will store my certificate along with a private key in a PFX file. And I can then transport that wherever it will be a safe place, burn it to a CD and put it in a safe or whatever else it is that I want to do. Now, another way to get the appropriate credentials to run something would be to use the run as command. This is a command line item that we would run, and it's very similar in a way to right-clicking on a specific application on the Start menu and choosing Run as Administrator. That would elevate our privileges. Well, the Run as command could be used to elevate privileges in a similar fashion. Maybe I don't have enough privileges with the logon credentials that I currently used. Then if I'm a help desk person and I'm trying to help somebody who's logged onto their computer but they're just an average user, I might need to apply my higher level credentials. So I could use the run as item. What this does is it allows me to apply different credentials than the logged on user. And it might not always be for escalation. It might just simply be because I want to apply that application to a different user context. And if that's the case, you can do the run as, and then with a / profile item, you can also load a different profile from that command line as well. And then maybe I have an application that likes to save changes to a certain location. Well, if I use the profile item, it'll save it to a different profile and not the one of the currently logged on user. but it does apply those different credentials regardless. This is not applicable, by the way, to any applications or consoles or something like that that already require elevation. So it's one of those things where if you click it, it gives you the user account control prompt saying that you need to elevate your privileges. Well, if it already would do something like that anyway, then you can't run as alongside of it. Okay, a good example of that would be something like computermanagement.msc or something like this. Now, if you do have a local administrator account that is enabled, then you could run one of those types of an app if you elevated to the local administrator account in the run as command. By the way, this will all make more sense when I actually show it to you here in just a couple of minutes. The administrator account, by the way, on Windows machines starting with Windows Vista is always disabled out of the box. So you can't use it anyway. But you would have to go into the user management and you'd have to enable that administrator account. Also, if you want to save your credential that you enter in the run as item with the username and a password, if you want to save those to Credential Manager, just use a /save cred in whatever it is that you type in the run as. So let's go ahead and take a look at an example of how I might use this. And here I decided to actually just use a different user account. I'm using Francine here, and if I do a who am I /all, then we can see that Francine does not have any special privileges. I've done nothing unusual with her account, except that I added her to the remote desktop users security group so that I can show you this in a remote desktop session. And then here is her SID, by the way. Not really here nor there particularly, other than the fact that sometimes you need to identify a user's SID, and that's a unique security identifier. All Windows computers will start with S-1-5-21, and then in the middle here will be uniqueness according to each machine or Active Directory, and then the last four are directly tied to her specific user account. This shows again what privileges she has, what kinds of things she can do. And what you might want to do here is to escalate privilege for someone else. So maybe I, as the administrator, need to open up a highly privileged account. I can't think of anything right offhand, but let's just use Notepad, for example. So I might do a run as /, and then user trainer@nuggetlab.com space, and then I would do a whatever the name of the application was. So notepad.exe, for example. I'd enter in the password, and then we would launch notepad.exe. Now, one of the advantages of this is that by default, we'll also load the profile for this user. So if I were to type something in here and then do a file and a save as, then it would give me the opportunity to save this into the trainer's directory as opposed to Francine. So let's just try that. Do a file and a save as. Here it'll just show us documents, okay? And what documents are these? I mean, whose my documents is this? Well, if I go up to Documents Library, remember we looked at that in a previous nugget, I can see here that it belongs to the trainer account. So by virtue of that, then I can then go ahead and save this, my trainer file, okay? Something like that. And that would be under the privileges and the credentials of the run as user account of the trainer account. It's also important to know what a user's rights are and how to add additional rights if you want. Remember when we just did that who am I /all? Well, that showed us the SID, plus it showed group memberships. Some of the group memberships as well as the privileges that a user might have. So you can configure additional privileges that they might have through a group policy object, but it's kind of cumbersome. For example, here I've gone to the backup files and directory, and you can kind of follow the path to see where I'm at right here. But it's much more sensible for me to just go into this, and instead of adding an additional user or group, why not just add my user account or group to the backup operators group? And you can see that administrators can do this as well. But generally, that's how we will administer these kinds of user rights, is by changing their group, their membership, in built-in groups instead. Now, I've got a document as well that identifies the major built-in groups here, so that you can know what kind of privileges that the different ones have. So, for example, if you want someone to be able to fully administer a computer, you would want to add them to the administrator's security group. On the other hand, if you wanted them just to be able to monitor performance, you might add them to the Performance Monitor Log Users and the Performance Monitor Users security group. This document is called userrights.pdf, and again, it's available for you up on nuggetlab.com. Now let's take a look at another topic here, and that is account policies. Now, these account policies mainly relate to things like logons, including the password and the lockout. Let's take a look at some examples of that. Here, I've just logged on to a local computer, and I've gone to the local computer policy under Computer Configuration, Windows Settings, Security Settings, Account Policies. And then password policy. And we can see here that we have a password history. What does this mean? This means that I cannot, when it comes time that my password expires after 45 days here, that's the maximum password age, I can't just reset it to the exact same thing that it was before. Because I have to have uniqueness 5 times in a row before I can go back to the original password that I had before. Okay? The minimum password age means that I also cannot just change the password consecutively, 5 times in a row within the same minute, and then get back to so therefore be able to satisfy my password history, and again, go back to my original password. Okay, so this prevents me, these two things right here prevent me from just reselecting the same exact password over and over again. Then the minimum password length obviously is 7 characters, and complexity requirements would be things such as uppercase, lowercase, special characters, numbers, things of this nature. Now some people look at this one and say, store passwords using reversible encryption. Ooh, encryption. I want that. I'm going to enable this item right here. Don't ever do that. Because that's not what you think it is. It does store the password, and it does encrypt it. It stores the password on the local hard drive. First of all, that's a bad thing. You don't want to store the actual password, even if it is encrypted, pretty much anywhere. I would trust it with Active Directory, and the local security authority is good at handling the password. But otherwise, you don't want to store the password anywhere. And secondly, notice that it says it's reversible encryption. That means that it uses encryption methods that can be easily reversed. And some types of encryption are one-way encryptions, so that once you encrypt it, then you cannot not decrypt it using the same method. Well, reversible means easily decrypted, pretty much is what that basically amounts to. So we don't want that, and that's what these things are, is the account policies for password policy. And then there's the account lockout policy. And for this one, the lockout duration, we could set that up for a certain period of time. I don't actually have any threshold set up, so that's probably why it's not giving me any items there. But let's say it'll lock me out after, let's be generous, let's say 5 invalid logon attempts. If I choose that, then it's going to automatically select these other 2 items. Let's go ahead and take a look at those. The account lockout duration, let's say, on Friday, I reset my password. And then on the weekend, I went to the lake, and I had a few adult beverages, and I just happened to kill off the brain cells that stored that password that I reset it to on Friday. So now when I come back in on Monday, I can't remember my password, and I keep typing it in. Finally, after 5 invalid logon attempts, I get locked out. How long am I going to be locked out? For 30 minutes. How long will it take to reset my account lockout counter? Again, 30 minutes. Now you can adjust that so that I might make this one a different time length. So maybe I'd make it, let's just make it 10 minutes. All right. Now what does this mean? This means that if I've logged on 4 times and still haven't gotten it right, then I just sit there staring at the computer and I say, I know I can think of this if I just try hard enough. Well, if I just wait 10 minutes, it'll reset my invalid logon attempts back to 0, and I'll then have 5 more attempts. So that's what that's about. Just be aware of those settings, and they fairly well explain themselves. Also, the settings we looked at there were for a local workgroup computer. In a domain environment, none of those settings work. Only a group policy object, not a local policy, will work. Those settings are all set on the domain level by default under the default domain policy. And it forcibly applies to any computer that's a member of that domain. Alright, now as we switch to a different topic here and discuss user account control, I'm reminded of my days in college. You see, I was kind of cocky and everything when I got to be, I don't know, an upperclassman. Maybe I was a junior or a senior. And I went into the first day of class for the new semester, and there was a new professor there. And I decided that I was going to give him a hard time. I was just going to be a real smart aleck and stuff like that. And so I started really hassling this guy, and really kind of in good humor. I wasn't trying to be mean or anything like that. I was just kind of being jocular. And how's that for a good word? Jocular. Anyway, so he started to kind of, I think, get just a little bit annoyed with me because he was a big Phillies fan. And when he mentioned that just offhandedly, I said, "Who are the Phillies?" Well, he got a little upset with me. So he said, "What's your name?" At which time I responded, "My name is Dave McKenzie," which was actually one of the other guys in the classroom, and I didn't want to take credit for being James Conrad at that particular moment because I knew it could affect my grade. Well, unfortunately, I didn't have the presence of mind to think of a name of a student who was not in the class at the time. Brilliant guy that I was at the time, Dave McKenzie, was sitting right next to me. And of course, he spoke up and said, "He's not Dave McKenzie, I am. That's James Conrad." And then the professor wrote something down in his book, and let's just say I passed. I don't want to say what grade I got, but I did pass. Well, that's kind of what happens with user account control as well. Because when you have to do a certain action or you're called upon to know your identity, you have to enter in the identity, the user account control prompt for administrative credentials. And of course, you can't lie about it like I did. You actually have to enter in a legitimate account. This really has a lot to do with users who in the past have logged on as admins. This is, for example, the case in Windows XP and every previous operating system, for example. For example, when people get a new computer from the computer store, most of the time those are OEM machines that will prompt the user to create their first account when they first turn on the computer, and that account is normally going to be an administrator account. That's probably the account they'll use for the entire time they have that machine. Well, that could really cause some problems because when they're logged on as an administrator on one of these previous operating systems, malware could execute. Or this could happen in a couple of different ways. Number one, the user might download something from the internet that looks like a cool utility to help speed up your PC or clean out your registry. Unfortunately, it may actually also clean out your bank account. So they will double-click on it and launch this thing, not realizing that this really should require administrative access, or that it's going to make potentially devastating changes to the system. Now, user account control does not fix all of that, because even now, a user who is an administrator could double-click on something malicious and just provide permission for it to continue on. So hopefully they also have antivirus products or something like that. But anyway, the other thing that could happen here is it could execute under the administrator's credentials without that user's knowledge. This very often happened with malware in previous operating systems, so that if a user went to a malicious web page, for example, there were certain tricks that were in the design of that page that could cause certain applications or executables to self-execute. And it would do it silently so that the user wouldn't even know that it was going on. And what do you know, but now there's a keystroke logger on that computer capturing the user's online banking passwords. So that's one of the things that could happen. The other thing is the user, just on purpose, since they're logged on as an administrator account, they could misconfigure something. I mean, if they go into computer management, they start poking around and deleting stuff and formatting drives and whatnot, well, they could get themselves into some trouble. But user account control, even if the user is an administrator, will at least put up a moment of pause where the user has to stop and say, "Oh, I'm supposed to click continue. I wonder if this is going to be something important." Now, of course, most users that are uneducated about computers will still just blow right past that and still misconfigure something. But at least it does give us some additional level, and it's very useful as well in something like a family where maybe you have a parent that is somewhat technically knowledgeable, and they have children, smaller children, who are just starting to use the computer. Well, they very often are the ones that are downloading malware and these additional toolbars and all this kind of stuff. But if you have those children log on under their own user accounts and they're not administrators, then they have to get permission. They have to have the appropriate credentials to allow those things to execute. And hopefully the mom or dad would know better. This is the same thing that happens in the corporation, where mom and dad, this case being IT help desk folks, for example, will have to provide consent to allow one of those things to happen, and the average desktop user does not normally have administrative access in many cases. Some environments they still do, and this may be because there are certain applications that are legacy applications that require administrative access, and there's no way around it. Now, we saw earlier in this whole series, there are some ways that you can get around a lot of that stuff, but there may be some isolated cases where you can't. Now, what happens with user account control is it will prompt you, and if you're already logged on as an administrative account, then you'll just have to click on continue or yes, or one of those types of messages, and allow the installation or change to continue on. Otherwise, if you're not an administrator, then you have to provide the administrative credentials, and somebody will have to enter those in for that user. Some other things to keep in mind with these concepts is that by default, all users, even if you're the domain admin or an enterprise admin, guess what? You're still a standard user. Yeah, that's the actual security context that you have when you are currently logged onto the computer. Even though you entered in your administrative credentials, whatever you click on, whatever you execute, you are doing it just as a standard user, and that's a good thing, because that will prevent some certain types of applications that try to escalate themselves into a higher level of privilege. It'll prevent them from being able to do that without prompting the administrator to see that something is going on there. This has only happened to me one time, by the way, with malicious software. I was just sitting at my laptop, and I can't remember what I was doing, but I think I might have just had a brain cramp, that or I was just taking a nap, which happens every couple hours. Anyway, all of a sudden, I heard a ding or something like that on the screen, and I looked up, and there was a user account control prompt right there. Well, I hadn't even touched the keyboard or the mouse for probably the last 10 minutes of my nap, so who knows where that came from. But it was probably some kind of malware or something from a web page that I had open that prompted up. So that's kind of just a speed bump that will help hopefully educated users to click no instead of to click on yes. Also, with admin approval mode, this is another portion that we have within this. If you're logged on as an administrator, again, your context is still going to be as a standard user, but if you're logged on with administrator credentials, I guess I should say, you have to consent to allow something to continue on, and like I said before, if you're not an admin, you have to enter credentials. There's also the secure desktop that takes place within this. What actually happens is that a bitmap will be created of your entire desktop, and then you'll see the desktop dimmed. Well, that's actually just a bitmap of your desktop. In fact, if you have a movie playing in the background, for example, I'm not saying I ever do that while I'm working, but that could have happened once or twice. Anyway, then that movie will actually freeze in its visual appearance because it's just a bitmap. Now, what happens here with the secure desktop is that nothing can interact with the desktop or anything else that's going on there until the prompt is answered or 150 seconds elapse. And if 156 seconds elapse without anybody clicking on anything, it'll just default to the no answer, and it will not allow it to execute. Now, there are a couple of reasons for that dim desktop. One of those is that when it's dim, nothing else can go on. Some malware will be able to prompt you with something in the foreground, while in the background actually executing something else. So it's kind of a shell game, and it kind of is a distractor meant to take your attention away from something else that might be going on. Well, that would prevent that sort of thing from happening, supposedly anyway. But the thing that I have found out with this is that when you get a user account control prompt, very often if you're clicking around doing other things on the desktop, then sometimes that will not come to the foreground like it should. By design, it's supposed to. Very often, it does not, and I'll see after a few moments that it's blinking on the taskbar. And it's not until I click it that it comes to the foreground and gives me a secure desktop. The other part about that is that it's a visual cue. You see, what happens is a lot of malware, they are able to almost exactly duplicate the same exact dialog boxes and buttons and interface that you have with normal administrative tools. So it might prompt something like that, and then the administrator who's seen all of this interface before in its actual legitimate form thinks that it's the Windows edition of a dialog box, and they'll click OK or click on something, which actually launches that malware. So by using secure desktop and the dimmed desktop, that's your visual clue that it's actually a message that is coming truly from Windows. And then finally, I'm just going to talk to you about the configuration of user account control. There's several settings for this, but the overall interfaces are pretty simple. There's the control panel item, and there's the group policy. Let's go ahead and take a look at both of these items where I'm logged on as the administrator, and we're also going to go just show you an example of how user account control works. For example, I don't really have any ideas here for what I want to execute, but let's just say that I wanted to run, I don't even know, FileZilla. How about that? That's my FTP client that I sometimes use. So I double-click on that. Well, that is a user account control prompt. It says, do you want to allow the following program from an unknown publisher? By the way, there's several different types of prompts that will have different interfaces depending upon what it is that you're trying to accomplish by running this application. This is, when we say unknown publisher, it means that there's not a signature from a known certification authority accompanying this executable. So this tells me that it has not been vetted out as authentically from these people, from FileZilla or whoever it is. So I would just have to know good and well that I downloaded it from a good site and that it was indeed the software that I think it is. And if you want to confirm where it's coming from, you can look at the program location there. In this case, I would want it, so I'd go ahead and click on yes, and then we just continue on through the interface here to allow it to continue its installation. And then another interface you might see would be something that is signed, but it still needs administrative credentials. For example, here's WinZip. So I'm going to double click on that to install it. And here it says, do you want to allow the following program to make changes to your computer? And then I would just say yes or no. I'm going to say no because I don't really need to install that right now. But if I had said yes, of course, it would just take me through the next wizard, and then we would have it installed. Oh, and I just closed that, and I remembered something else I wanted to show you. Let's take a look at something like this as well. This is just another application, but this particular one also involves a I'm going to go ahead and say yes to it. A driver that requires administrative privilege to be able to go ahead and install. So I'm going to kind of go next, finish through this, and I'll wait for the... There it is. Here it says, Windows can't verify the publisher of this driver software, and only an administrator could say, install this driver software anyway. By the way, this is where I wanted to point out, Microsoft officially says that you cannot install unsigned drivers on 64-bit editions of Windows. Well, let's see what version of Windows I'm running here. I'll go to Properties. Gotta move this out of the way, I guess. I'm working with a 64-bit version of Windows 7 Enterprise Edition. Guess what? I can still install the software. So I don't know where they get the notion that you cannot install unsigned drivers, but anyway, there it goes. And then I'll just go ahead and finish. Now I have installed that application, and when I did so, I was elevated in my privilege. Now that it's finished, I'm just back down to a standard user. By the way, let me point out what this thing is. It's really handy. If you haven't used it before, just as a quick side note, I can mount media here, and I can mount ISO files into this thing. So I can go into this, and I can look for something like, Windows Office 2007 Enterprise, and there's an actual ISO disk image file. Kind of says it off to the sides here. It's a disk image, and I could just open that, and it will appear then as if it is a drive letter right here, and it would be drive E right here. Okay, that's just all that is, and it's real handy. You should look into it. Very handy for any Windows administrator. But anyway, I digress just a little bit because I was trying to get to where we were going to show you how to adjust the user account control settings. What you'll do is you'll just get into Control Panel, and then you don't go to User Accounts. You go to System and Security, and then you'll see here there change user account control settings. So we'll click on that, and then we'll start to make changes. This is the default setting where it's going to notify you when programs try to make changes to your computer. You can also crank that up, and you can say, and it always notify me even when I make changes to Windows settings that requires you to manually answer a prompt every time you make even somewhat innocent changes to something. But it's a higher level of security. Generally, the higher up you go with this little slider, the more secure you are. The lower you go with this, the less secure you are. If we go down lower, you can see it doesn't notify me at all when I make changes to Windows settings. But it will still notify you when programs try to make changes. Except that in this one, it does not dim your desktop. In the one above that, by default, it will dim your desktop. This one, it does not. Okay? And then here, never notify. That's the least secure of all of these things. And that would be inadvisable for certain, because then, again, applications could run without your knowledge, or an uneducated user could just go ahead and execute things that they shouldn't allow. And then here we have a local group policy, but of course in the domain you would use a group policy object and link it to the domain or to an organizational unit. But this is just a local settings, but the settings all read the same. Here, for example, let me just expand some of this out. The admin approval mode for the built-in administrator account. What's that about? You see, for any other account, it's going to prompt you for anything that would normally require administrative access. The exception to that is the built-in administrator account, which is normally disabled, but if enabled, then it usually does not receive a user account control prompt. So in other words, it acts kind of like it did back in NT and XP or 2000. So here, if we were to double click on this and choose enabled, then even the built-in administrator account would still get user account control. There's also this user account control allow UI access applications to prompt for elevation without using secure desktop. Okay, that's disabled because this is a double negative. Disabling, not using secure desktop. If I choose enable, then we will not have to use the secure desktop where everything is dimmed out. A lot of these are self-explanatory, so I'm not going to exhaust them, other than to point out this one, the behavior of the elevation prompt for administrators in admin approval mode. For this one, you can choose, for example, elevate without prompting, which again is pretty much the same as turning it off. Prompt for credentials on the secure desktop. Now, I thought you might look at that and say, I thought we already had to do that. No, this is for administrators. Normally, administrators, when they log on and they try to do something that requires administrative access, all they have to do is click on continue or yes. Whereas in this case, they'll still have to enter in their credentials even though they did that when they logged on. The reason for this is because it protects unattended workstations where an administrator might have gone off to lunch or something like that, and a passerby could view that unlocked workstation and perform some kind of an act or some kind of an executable or something without the administrator's permission. Here they would still have to know the credentials, so that's kind of what that's all about. And as I mentioned, a lot of these others pretty well explain themselves. I do recommend that you make note of this location and just kind of browse through those different items, and they are fairly well self-explanatory, but nonetheless important to know about. In this nugget, we talked about authentication and user account control, where we started off by talking about authentication methods. I also mentioned authorization. Remember, authorization is when you've successfully authenticated, then you know what access to resources you can get. That's the authorization. The authentication methods were like smart cards, biometrics, or a conventional username and password, which is where often people forget their password and have an issue with authentication. Remember, with local accounts, you'll lose things such as your EFS certificates when you reset that password. For Credential Manager, this is where we can store saved usernames and passwords, for example, things like websites that we've accessed or network resources that we've had to enter in some credentials for. We took a look also at certificate management as a way of being able to view certificates as well as manage them. And we looked at the run as command too. This is how you can elevate your privilege beyond what the standard user might have. And we looked at also user rights. Remember, if you're a member of a certain group, built-in group, which I list for you in a PDF, then you'll have an additional level of rights there as well. And then user account control, which remember is the prompting that requires you to allow consent in order for something to continue on, as long as it's something like an installation, a driver change, or a system change. Well, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.